Adrian Wolfe and Meera Wolfe appeared to have the perfect life, a billionaire husband, a stunning wife, and a child on the way. But behind the glossy facade, a shocking secret would turn love into murder and shatter everything they knew. From the outside, the marriage looked like a modern fairy tale built for headlines and admiration. Adrian Wolfe was one of Australia's most celebrated billionaires, a self-made figure who had turned renewable energy investments into a vast fortune. Newspapers praised his discipline, his vision, and his calm public image. When news broke that he had married Meera Wolfe, a woman of Indian origin he met during an international charity initiative, the story instantly caught attention. It was framed as a cross-cultural love story, proof that success had not hardened him and that he still believed in romance. Meera appeared rarely, but when she did, she was presented as graceful and reserved. Photographs showed her standing slightly behind Adrian, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. Media outlets described her as private, traditional, and supportive. To many, her quiet presence seemed to balance Adrian's commanding personality. Their wedding was small by billionaire standards, yet carefully curated. Every detail that reached the public reinforced the idea of a thoughtful man who valued intimacy over excess. They settled into a luxury waterfront apartment overlooking the harbor, a place filled with glass walls, muted colors, and expensive art. The home was protected by layers of security, offering both privacy and control. Adrian's life ran on schedules, assistants, and structured routines. Meera's life quickly adapted to fit inside that system. She had no job, no visible social circle, and no reason to leave the apartment unless accompanied. Those close to Adrian assumed this was her choice, a preference for a quiet life away from cameras. The pregnancy announcement elevated their story even further. Business magazines ran features about Adrian preparing for fatherhood, framing it as the next chapter of his legacy. Investors saw stability. The public saw softness. Meera's pregnancy was often mentioned, but she was never interviewed. Her health, emotions, and personal journey remained unspoken, hidden behind carefully released statements approved by Adrian's team. Privately, small details hinted that the perfection was fragile. Staff noticed that Meera asked permission before making simple requests. Her phone access appeared limited. Calls were short and often supervised. Gifts from India arrived less frequently over time. When relatives asked about visiting Australia, plans were delayed or quietly dismissed. Still, nothing seemed alarming enough to raise concern. Wealth has a way of normalizing control, especially when wrapped in luxury. Adrian himself seemed proud of the image he had created. He spoke about family values at conferences and mentioned his unborn child as motivation for future projects. His words were polished and reassuring. Yet those who worked closely with him noticed a growing obsession with details. Documents were reviewed repeatedly. Background checks were expanded. Legal teams were instructed to verify information that had already been approved months earlier. To outsiders, this appeared to be standard billionaire caution. No one suspected fear. No one imagined that a single piece of information, buried deep in paperwork, could threaten everything Adrian believed he owned. The apartment remained quiet, the harbor view unchanged, and the narrative of success continued without interruption. Chapter 1 of their story ended the same way it began, with admiration and envy from the outside. The world saw love, wealth, and a child on the way. What remained invisible was the fragile truth beneath it all, waiting to surface and turn admiration into horror. As Meera's pregnancy advanced, the quiet routines inside the apartment began to change. Medical paperwork, insurance forms, and residency renewals became unavoidable. Adrian insisted on overseeing every document personally, even those usually handled by assistants. What seemed like concern soon revealed itself as suspicion. He requested archived records from overseas, older than anything previously submitted. The deeper the search went, the more tense he became. His need for certainty was no longer about protection, it was about control. The discovery arrived buried in foreign records that had never been fully verified. Meera's age was not what Adrian believed when they married. The difference was not minor, and it carried implications he could not ignore. Her past identity did not align with the timeline she had shared. Earlier documents used a different birth year, a different version of her life, and traces of a history she had never mentioned. To Adrian, this was not simply a personal betrayal. It was a threat to his reputation, his image, and the narrative he had sold to the world. Instead of confronting the truth openly, Adrian withdrew inward. His demeanor shifted from polished confidence to cold precision. Meera noticed the change immediately. His attention became transactional. Affection disappeared, replaced by scrutiny. Every movement, every appointment, every call was monitored. What once felt like protection now felt like confinement. The apartment that had symbolized luxury slowly turned into a controlled environment where nothing happened without approval. Fear drove Adrian's actions. He imagined headlines questioning his judgment. He imagined investors doubting his discipline. He imagined ridicule more than loss. The idea that the public might see him as deceived was unbearable. In his mind, Meera's age was not a personal detail, but a flaw in the image he owned. The pregnancy complicated everything further. A child meant permanent connection, permanent exposure, and permanent questions. Financial restrictions followed. Meera's access to accounts was reduced. Independent spending stopped. Medical appointments were rescheduled or canceled under the excuse of privacy. When doctors requested additional tests, approvals were delayed. Adrian framed these decisions as efficiency, but the pattern was clear. Control increased as fear grew. Meera's isolation deepened. Messages to her family became shorter and less frequent. Packages from India sat unopened. Attempts to plan a visit were quietly blocked by visa complications that never resolved. To the outside world, this silence was invisible. Wealth masked absence. No one questioned why a pregnant woman was rarely seen outside her home. Adrian's legal team was instructed to revisit prenuptial clauses and inheritance structures. New confidentiality agreements were drafted. Old staff members were replaced with those who asked fewer questions. Security logs were tightened. Surveillance became routine. What he called preparation was, in reality, panic. The truth about Meera's age did not fade with time. It consumed Adrian. He replayed the discovery repeatedly, imagining alternate outcomes where he had never married her, never trusted her, never allowed the story to exist. In his mind, responsibility shifted away from himself. He framed Meera as the source of the risk, the reason his perfect life felt unstable. Meera, meanwhile, carried more than a child. She carried regret, fear, and a growing sense that she was no longer safe. The warmth she once believed in had vanished. In its place stood a man who saw her not as a wife, but as a problem that refused to disappear. Chapter 2 ended not with confrontation, but with silence. A dangerous silence filled with unspoken anger, calculated decisions, and a truth that had already changed the course of everything. Adrian's public world continued to function with impressive precision, even as his private life grew increasingly unstable. He appeared at business summits, signed international deals, and spoke confidently about long-term investments. Cameras captured his calm smile and steady voice. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed. The billionaire remained in control, untouched by scandal or personal strain. This contrast between image and reality became one of the most disturbing aspects of what followed. Inside the apartment, life moved according to new rules that were never spoken aloud, but strictly enforced. Meera's days became predictable and empty. She woke, ate, rested, and waited. Her pregnancy advanced, yet professional care was inconsistent. When medical staff visited, Adrian was always present. Questions were redirected. Records were kept under lock and key. Even small requests required approval. What was once framed as concern now felt like surveillance. Adrian's obsession with order intensified. Security systems were upgraded without explanation. Cameras were added in hallways and common spaces. Access logs were reviewed daily. Staff schedules changed frequently, ensuring no one spent too much time alone with Meera. Longtime employees were replaced by contractors bound by strict confidentiality agreements. Each change was subtle on its own, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate isolation. Financial behavior during this period later drew the attention of investigators. Large sums were quietly transferred between accounts. Assets were restructured, trusts were adjusted. These moves were not illegal on the surface, but their timing raised questions. They suggested preparation, not for growth, but for separation. Adrian appeared to be creating distance between himself and anything that could tie him permanently to Meera. Meera's family sensed something was wrong. Calls were rare and often cut short. Messages arrived late, sometimes days after being sent. When relatives asked about her health, responses were vague and reassuring, but lacked detail. Attempts to arrange travel were met with delays blamed on paperwork or medical advice. From thousands of miles away, concern grew, but there was little they could do. Adrian's wealth and influence formed an invisible wall that kept questions from reaching the surface. Neighbors noticed changes too, though none imagined the truth. Meera had once been seen on the balcony in the mornings, watching the harbor in silence. Over time, the curtains stayed closed, deliveries stacked up at the door longer than usual, lights remained off in rooms that were once bright. These details were small and easily dismissed, yet they painted a picture of disappearance happening slowly, in plain sight. As the pregnancy entered a critical stage, the lack of consistent medical oversight became dangerous. Warning signs were missed or ignored. Adrian justified every decision with logic and efficiency. He spoke of privacy, security, and stress reduction. Behind those explanations was a deeper motive. Control had become his way of managing fear. If he could control the environment, the narrative, and the people involved, he believed he could control the outcome. The unborn child, instead of bringing hope, became a source of anxiety. Adrian viewed the future not as a family, but as a series of risks waiting to unfold. Each day the pregnancy continued, the truth about Meera's past felt closer to exposure. His patience thinned, his behavior grew colder, compassion was replaced by calculation. By the end of this chapter, the gap between who Adrian appeared to be and who he had become was vast. The successful billionaire and the controlling husband existed simultaneously, separated by locked doors and carefully managed appearances. Meera remained trapped in that space, carrying a life she hoped would protect her, unaware that it had already been marked as part of the problem. The tension inside the apartment reached a breaking point, even as the world outside remained unaware. The stage was set for a night that would erase the illusion forever. The night everything ended began without noise or warning. The city moved as it always did, lights reflecting across the harbor, traffic flowing below the apartment. Inside, the controlled calm that had defined recent weeks felt heavier, almost unnatural. Meera was in the final stage of her pregnancy, physically exhausted and increasingly unwell. Records later showed missed appointments and unanswered follow-ups, small omissions that would soon carry devastating weight. Emergency services received a call late that night requesting immediate assistance. By the time responders arrived at the luxury apartment, the atmosphere was tense and carefully staged. Meera was found unresponsive. Despite rapid attempts to revive her, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The unborn child could not be saved. The initial explanation offered was sudden medical complications related to pregnancy, a tragic but believable scenario. Yet from the first moments, subtle details disturbed investigators. The apartment was unusually clean, almost sterile. Surfaces showed signs of recent wiping. Certain items that would normally be present during a medical emergency were missing. Security footage from the building revealed unexplained gaps during critical time frames. Camera malfunctions were cited, but the timing seemed too convenient to ignore. An autopsy was ordered as standard procedure. The results shifted the case dramatically. Toxic substances were found in Meera's system, substances that should never have been present and were not part of any prescribed treatment. The dosage suggested deliberate administration rather than accident. Further examination confirmed that the pregnancy had been progressing normally. There was no natural cause that explained her sudden death. Attention turned inward, toward the man who had made the call. Adrian's behavior that night appeared composed, almost rehearsed. Phone records showed activity that contradicted his initial timeline. Messages were sent and deleted. Calls were made to legal advisors before some family members were notified. These actions alone did not prove guilt, but combined with the autopsy findings, they raised serious suspicion. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, patterns from the previous months took on new meaning. The isolation, the financial restructuring, the tightened security, and the medical interference no longer appeared coincidental. They suggested preparation. What had once seemed like excessive caution now looked like a framework designed to limit witnesses and control outcomes. Further searches uncovered traces of the toxic substance within the apartment, carefully hidden among household items. Purchase records led to intermediaries and shell transactions. The complexity of the trail reflected someone with resources, knowledge, and intent. This was not a crime of sudden rage. It was methodical. Public reaction shifted rapidly once the findings became known. The image of a grieving billionaire husband began to crack. Media outlets revisited old interviews and press releases, now reading them through a darker lens. Questions poured in about Meera's disappearance from public view and the lack of prenatal transparency. What had once been dismissed as privacy was now seen as concealment. Meera's family was informed of the findings through official channels. Their grief turned into disbelief, then anger. The distance that had once protected Adrian could no longer shield him. Jurisdictional cooperation expanded the investigation internationally, pulling records from India and Australia together into a single narrative. By the end of the night's investigation, the case was no longer about tragedy. It was about intent. A woman and her unborn child were dead, not because of fate, but because someone decided their existence threatened something more valuable than life itself. The luxury apartment, once a symbol of success, became a crime scene, and the silence inside it finally spoke louder than any headline ever had. The weeks that followed transformed the investigation into one of the most closely watched cases in the country. What began as a suspicious death quickly evolved into a full-scale examination of power, control, and deception. Adrian Wolfe was formally charged, and the billionaire status that once protected him now magnified every detail of the case. Courtrooms filled with media, analysts, and spectators eager to understand how a man with everything could be connected to such brutality. As evidence was presented, the story unfolded with chilling clarity. Financial records revealed a pattern of asset movements designed to isolate Meera and her unborn child from future claims. Trusts were restructured, beneficiaries altered, and legal barriers erected in the months leading up to her death. These actions painted a picture of foresight rather than panic. Prosecutors argued that the crime was not impulsive but calculated, rooted in fear of exposure rather than loss of control alone. The discovery of Meera's true age became a central element of motive. Investigators demonstrated how Adrian viewed this revelation not as a personal issue, but as a professional threat. Emails and internal notes showed an obsession with reputation management. Risk assessments treated personal relationships the same way he treated failing investments. Once Meera's past no longer fit his desired narrative, she was reduced to a liability in his mind. Witness testimony reinforced this pattern. Former staff described sudden changes in access, increased surveillance, and strict instructions regarding Meera's movements. Medical professionals detailed delayed approvals and unusual restrictions. Legal advisors spoke of last-minute contract revisions and confidentiality demands that went far beyond standard practice. Each account added weight to the argument that Adrian had been building a controlled environment where consequences could be managed. The defense attempted to frame the death as a tragic misinterpretation of complex circumstances. They pointed to stress, privacy concerns, and the pressures of public life. But the toxicology reports, security gaps, and financial planning undermined these claims. The timeline left little room for doubt. The jury was shown not just what happened, but how long it had been forming. Public opinion shifted decisively. The billionaire image collapsed under the volume of evidence. Companies distanced themselves. Investments froze. Boards removed his name. What had taken decades to build unraveled in months. The case became a symbol of how power, when unchecked, could distort judgment and erase empathy. The verdict arrived after long deliberation. Adrian Wolfe was found guilty. The sentence ensured he would spend the rest of his life removed from the world he once controlled. There were no dramatic outbursts, no visible remorse. The silence that followed felt heavy, final, and deserved. Meera's story did not end in the courtroom. Advocacy groups highlighted her case as an example of hidden abuse within high-profile relationships. Questions were raised about how wealth and status can obscure warning signs and silence victims. Her family, though broken by loss, found some measure of justice in the truth being publicly acknowledged. In the end, the case was not remembered for the billions lost or the empire destroyed. It was remembered for a woman and an unborn child whose lives were taken to protect an image. The documentary closed on a sobering reality. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are not driven by desperation, but by the fear of being seen for who they truly are.